Alan Johnson, was your unprivileged background, do you think, an advantage perhaps in succeeding in politics?
In Labour politics, maybe it is. There's a kind of inverse view of these things where, remember that old Monty Python sketch where there's guys sitting around and one of them says, there were 6 of us living in a rolled up newspaper, and the other one said, luxury, 28 of us living in a shoebox. So there's an element of that in the party, which is why I always kept very quiet when I was in office about my background, because you don't want to, me and my sister didn't go through a difficult childhood to give ourselves a good backstory for the Labour Party. But I think all parties now are struggling to get the right kind of mixture, diversity and social class, if you like. It seems there is a route into politics, and that route is university, usually PPE degree, coming in as a special advisor, someone finds you a seat and hey presto, you're a member of Parliament. I think that's a problem, as much a problem in the Labour Party as it is in other.
Do you have other suggestions then, perhaps, a route into politics? Because you've got to come from somewhere.
Well, the trade union movement was a huge part of social mobility, and about giving people who'd left school, like me, no qualifications or whatever, chances to, second, third, fourth chances to kind of immerse themselves in politics from a young age, and to get all those skills of public speaking, confidence, all that kind of stuff. And there's a new intern scheme, in fact, John, who's just started in my office, Mr. Speaker, with cross-party support, Hazel Blears and myself and several Tories and Lib Dems have started this scheme where instead of interns coming up here expected to work for nothing, they come in on a proper scheme where they're trained, they get, above minimum wage, they get accommodation found for them in London. And as a consequence, John, for instance, who's 32, got a kid, lives in Manchester, working class background, he's got a chance to come in and get a feel for politics, which seems to be one of the routes on the way to becoming members of Parliament.
As somebody then who grew up in poverty, I'd be interested to learn your thoughts on the current benefit system. So some people say it's too generous, and they often give extreme examples of where you can actually be better off on benefits than you can in work, whereas others claim that if there's to be any quality of life, it needs improving, it needs to be more generous. So do you think the system needs reform?
Oh, it definitely needs reform. It doesn't need reform in the way that the government are approaching it. We were reforming it. When we came into government, there were 2.6 million people on incapacity benefit.
Right.
That figure had been 700,000 when the Tories came in 79. So from 700,000 to 2.6 million, because they pushed people out of the shipyards as they lost their jobs in the coal mines, steelworks, they pushed them onto incapacity benefit to keep the unemployment statistics down. And the rate at which they were coming on to incapacity benefit was enormous. So, they accuse us of being a party of welfare, that accusation could be placed at their door. So we had to stop that flow and then deal with the stock, if you like, of turning that around. And in my time at Work and Pensions, we introduced this thing called Pathways to Work, where we asked people to come in who'd been on incapacity benefit voluntarily. We give them some therapy. They'll have one person that they'll deal with all the time. We changed the law so that if it didn't work out and they went back on incapacity benefit, they didn't have to go right through the system again. We had people beating down our doors who've been on incapacity benefit for 10 years saying, we want this help. We want to be back in work. Now, at that time, there were lots of jobs around, and that's the principal issue, is there has to be jobs to go to. So, we are the Labour Party. That's the clue is in the title. And the welfare state was never designed for people to just live a life on benefits. But the way the government has this rhetoric about, people in string vests sleeping off their benefits, I think was a remark, George.
Right.
And trying to divide people. Most people who find themselves unemployed is entirely outside of their control, and they get back into work pretty quickly. There are very few people playing the system, but of course you need to cater for that minority. So I think this whole debate that if you're on welfare you're a loser is just divisive and destructive.
Tomorrow we'll be chatting to a colleague of yours, Jack Straw, who's just announced his intentions to resign as an MP. Do you similarly feel then perhaps you've reached the pinnacle of your career, or is there still work to do?
Oh, I'm long past the pinnacle. I'm well on the way down now. But, I mean, Jack's 69. And he's been here a long time and done an awful lot and achieved an awful lot. And done a lot for his constituency. The thing I admire about Jack, Blackburn was always at the forefront of what he did. Now, similarly, I want Hull, I've tried to be a good constituency MP, and there's a lot happening in Hull. And for 11 years I was a minister, and you try your best, but you can't dedicate as much time to the constituency as you'd want. So I can do that now, and I think I've got another kind of lease of life, another 5 years at least in me.
Fantastic. Will we perhaps see you returning to front bench politics then, or is it all about that constituency?
I doubt it. It's about constituency work. The extra time I get from not being a minister. I write. My book's doing pretty well. Second book on the way. Do a bit of media, some book reviews, all that. I enjoy doing that.
Why do you think that political parties so often fail to adopt the honesty ticket? So there's clearly an appetite for integrity in politics, and is the lack of those qualities why so many people feel that nothing's in it for them?
Well, I would challenge the view that there's no honesty, that there's a problem with honesty in politics.
There's not a problem with honesty in politics?
No, I don't think there is. I mean, the expenses scandal was a huge, terrible slur on politics, but it didn't mean that all politicians should be tarred as if our profession is more dishonest than the law or journalism. The fact is, we live in a world where if you said on the Today programme, actually I think I made a mistake with that policy, you'd immediately been castigated, you'd probably have to resign. And so you find a formulation of words that gets you through a situation like that. And it's part of the 24/7 media that, you can't have, a change of mind is called a U-turn, government U-turns. A disagreement on policy, even though there's collective responsibility and you're signed up to it, if you said I don't agree with that policy, you'd be betraying your own colleagues and there'd be a government split. So, I mean, you have to see the job that politicians have to do before you accuse them of dishonesty. And actually, in this world, if everyone was brutally honest, the person I'd least like is the person who says, I say what I think. So they do say what they think and upset a lot of people. And if you try and go through that society, so when at Christmas your Auntie Doris gives you a pair of socks.
Auntie Sue.
Is it Auntie Sue? And you instead of saying, this is rubbish, instead of being honest, this is rubbish, it's the last thing I wanted, why did you waste your money? You say, thank you very much, Auntie Sue. It's part of a civilised country, being dishonest, if you like, in that respect.
So on that note, more seriously though, if we all associate ourselves with party politics, the left, the right, Labour, Conservatives, don't we sometimes cut ourselves off from what might otherwise benefit
well, that's
society?
a different point. I think that's a very good point, actually. There's a different point from the kind of... the older I get, and Jack probably say this as well when you talk to him, the less interested I am in tribal politics, and I wasn't all that interested in it in the first place. I just can't get myself into this, they are all bad because they're Conservatives and they're all bad because they're all Liberal Democrats. We are all sainted because we're Labour. I mean, that, if you'll call it, I can't think of a better way to run a system in a democracy. I mean, Churchill famously said democracy is the worst system of all, apart from every other system that's ever been tried. So if you're trying to make yourself attractive to the electorate and saying vote for me rather than them, I can't think of a better system than a political party system. Having said that, you don't have to just trot out the party line on everything and wait for what central office send you in an email. So I think you're right, and that's something I think for individual politicians to approach.
When you resigned as Shadow Chancellor, I think that was, you had less than 4 months in the role. I'm not quite sure if that's, but the BBC suggested that you appeared not to know the rate of national insurance then paid by employees. So does a Chancellor or Shadow Chancellor need to know that much detail about?
No, this was one of those, what's the price of a slice loaf? Right. Sky Television, actually, not the BBC. who just came up with this question on a Sunday morning. What's the employer's rate of national insurance? Now, I bet you George Osborne couldn't answer that. I bet you. Any money you like.
Right.
It's not a detail you get into as a shadow chancellor. But, that wasn't why I resigned.
Yeah.
But that's just one of the things you have to put up with. Smart ass questions.
Are there many of those? Have you experienced many of those where you surprising?
No, because the vast majority of people who are interviewing you know that it's not a game. For the viewer to get anything out of it, it's about wider things and one specific answer on one particular question. I was Secretary of State for Health for 2 years. If someone had said to me, what's the cost of a certain drug, it's not what you do. It's not your job.
Yeah. When did you first meet Tony Blair, and did you know that he was going to be that influential?
That's a good question. No one's ever asked me that before. When did I first meet
Tony? It's not a smart-ass question, is it?
It's not at all, no. I was walking up the front at Blackpool, going back from the conference hall to my hotel, and General Secretary of my union, a guy called Alan Tuffin, saw Tony Blair walk. Probably one of the last times Tony Blair was allowed to walk anywhere without anyone with him, and unknown. So this would have been about, I suppose, late 80s.
Right.
And he was Shadow Employment Secretary, and Alan Tuffin introduced me to him. Did I know he was going? Well, not then, not with his hair blown about. Well, you had hair in those days, on the Blackpool seafront. But when I got to, I think that same week, I attended some event he was speaking at, and you kind of knew that was someone special. He had a little bit of fairy dust.
In the light then of the recent Commons vote not to go into Syria, do you think the Iraq war has, for the foreseeable future, sort of impaired Britain's ability to intervene on an international level?
I think undoubtedly there's an Iraq war dimension to this.
Yeah.
One dimension of it, of course, is that was the first time British troops ever went into action on a decision of Parliament. It's always been by royal prerogative before then. That was the very first time it had been debated and was overwhelmingly approved for whatever reason. And I think one result of that is you wouldn't put troops anywhere seriously without a parliamentary debate, and that's what happened over Syria. But I don't think Iraq might have been in the back of people's minds, and that in a good way, like, let's make sure we get this decision right and all that. I don't incidentally resolve from the Iraq decision. If it was the same debate, same time, I'd make the same decision, I'd vote yes. But on Syria, of course, it was a completely different set of circumstances. Prime Minister couldn't tell us what we were going to do. He made the ludicrous argument that you can intervene in terms of this issue of chemical weapons, but not be on either side of the civil war, which was ludicrous. And the UN Secretary General at the time was saying, well, we haven't analysed yet to know whether it was a chemical weapons attack. And all of that together meant that it was a strange decision by the Prime Minister to actually call us back. We were coming back from recess the following week anyway, so,
Okay. Were you at all involved in the transition between Blair stepping down and Gordon Brown coming to the leadership of the party?
In the sense I was there, I was Health Secretary when...
So did you get
Education Secretary when Tony stepped down on day one, and Health Secretary when Gordon took over on day two.
So did you get the sense that he was perhaps being pushed out almost?
Oh, I was involved in all that as well. It's in Tony's book, The Journey.
Yeah.
He was disgracefully being pushed out in the sense that here's a guy who'd won us 3 elections, who had said he's not going to serve a full term when he'd won his 3rd election victory. And so you knew he was going to step down at some time in that 4-year period, usually 4, maybe 5. And yet there was this petition signed by colleagues here that I still really hold it against them as to... in the end, he just about went on his own terms and had his last conference. And
so was he ready to leave office then when he did go? Do you think it was a bit early?
I think it was a bit early, yeah. Probably, I mean, he would have always given his successor a fair run at the next general election, so it'd always be about 2 years. But, you know, the furore started about 3 years before the next general election. I think that was undignified and unforgivable.
What about his relationship with Gordon Brown? Because that's been branded as unstable as other things as well, you know.
Well, Jack will probably know more about that. I mean, he was in the middle of that more than I was, in opposition as well. He came in 97. One thing's sure, at one stage, they were very close and they were a class act. And if they'd stayed very close and there hadn't been those divisions between them, I think it would have been good for the party. There is a school of thought that says it was kind of constructive tension between them that actually got the juices flowing and all that. And we know from Damien McBride's book, it led to some pretty unsavoury stuff. And I don't think, you know, that anyone in the Labour Party wants to see that happen again.
Has conservatism now ultimately triumphed? Because obviously we saw with Blair him move the centre ground of British politics over to the right, and socialism therefore had to adapt various political ideologies over there. So do you think that conservatism has now beaten?
No, and I think your analogy is wrong, actually. I think what Blair did is shift the centre ground to the left. To win an election, you have to be somewhere around the centre ground. You know, there's various views that you could have a Bolshevik revolution in this country where a few people, 17 people, decide that they're going to... Well, you can't do it now. Everyone's got the vote now. It's not going to happen in a mature democracy. So you have to appeal to the electorate. So when you say depth conservatism, when we took over in 97, there was a very strong argument against the minimum wage in this country. The Conservatives had halved international development budget. There was alternatives to the NHS, in fact a whole stream of them that are coming out of the Conservative Party, including using public money to bribe people to go into private medicine. All of these things, family-friendly policies like the introduction of 9 months maternity leave, paternity leave for the first time, these have all been adopted wholesale by the Conservatives. So, you know, I could equally make the argument it's kind of end. So, no, I think the curious thing is why, given that Lehman Brothers and the financial services collapse around the world was a crisis for capitalism, have left of centre parties been losing elections all over Europe, with the exception of France, and you know that's quite interesting. I'm quite a solution, but I certainly don't think it's the end of. It's sort of a triumph of conservatism.
Not even when he was described as Tory Blair. Not even then.
Well, you see, the thing about Tony, this is a strange thing about Tony. People used to say to him, "Oh, even you know, Tories are supporting us now." And Tony would point out that if we only depended on people who voted Labour to support us, we'd never get back into office. We'd lost four elections. But what did he do? He introduced a national minimum wage, which Keir Hardie was promoting in 1900. He devolved power to Scotland, which was one of our other founding principles, by the way, with the Scottish Parliament. He recruited more doctors and nurses, built more hospitals, put more money into education, introduced 3,000 Sure Start centres for early intervention, the education maintenance allowance for kids to stay on at school. I mean, there's nothing in that programme I can see that justifies Tory Blair.
Now, moving on to more current politics, and penultimately, the Labour Party has said it will soon table a motion in the Commons setting up proposals requiring all teachers to be qualified. I think you've claimed, though, that perhaps that shouldn't be the case, and specifically you've mentioned music teachers, saying that perhaps they should be.
This was on the telly last Thursday.
Right, will you be voting against that motion?
No. No, I'm not sure whether we're setting it up as a motion. I think Tristram's going to have an opposition day debate specifically on this issue. I think teachers should be qualified. And the point I was making on television the other night is there has to be enough flexibility in there. If you've got a great violinist who's prepared to come into the school, because you know we've struggled with this getting proper music tuition, and I'm a big passionate believer in that. And they're willing to come into the school and you know give some sessions. You wouldn't say, "Oh, go away and do a 2-year teacher training course before you can come out." That would be daft. Equally, there's some issues around IT, really expert people willing to give their time in schools. So in general, teachers, of course, should be qualified like any other profession. It's a noble profession, but there has to be some flexibility around the edges.
How would you draw the lines or get some policy in practice?
Actually, I think, heads and boards of governors are very good at drawing the line themselves. They understand this. I mean, even the free schools or academies where they have a lot of flexibility, they don't use it to bring in people. I mean, the famous example of that head teacher in Pimlico School who didn't last 5 minutes, which was a free school. Most of them use those powers very sensibly, and they wouldn't engage unqualified teachers.
Would, as a former postman, what do you make of this whole scenario of privatisation of the Royal Mail?
Disaster for the customer. It'll eventually be a disaster for the workforce, because especially now you've got very aggressive hedge funds involved as well. They'll be looking to drive down terms and conditions. But the real issue is about the customer. So in order to privatise Royal Mail, it's been wrenched away from the counters network. Nowhere else in the world has that happened. So post office counters, crucial to communities all over the country, particularly in rural areas, are now a separate entity to go their own way. Publicly owned, yes, but without the link with Royal Mail that sustained them for 459 years. So that's stage one, that's bad. Selling off Royal Mail, I guarantee, 10 years' time there won't be a Saturday delivery. Why should they? It's going to shareholders. It's hugely expensive to do a delivery on Saturday. The only reason you do it is because it's a public service and there's a public service commitment. It won't take long before, I'm sure, just like New Zealand when it was privatised, people in rural areas won't have the mail delivered to their door anymore. They'll have to go perhaps twice a week to a central collection point. The service will deteriorate. Absolutely sure it will be.
Is it too late for the Labour Party to do anything about it if they get back into government?
Probably, in the sense that it will cost a lot of money to buy it back, and money will be in short supply, and there'll be other things you'll want to do with money. I think the best thing to do with Royal Mail is to do something really amazing and give it to the workforce, sell it to the workforce, make it a John Lewis partnership on a huge scale. With counters, and they're talking about doing that with counters, individual counters. Do it with the whole of Royal Mail. Let the workforce own it. There's too few opportunities of workers actually having a stake in there. Not kind of stake where they sell a few shares, make a few bob, and then go out. I mean, in John Lewis partnership, you can only sell the shares back into the partnership. You don't take them outside of it. I think that's a wonderful principle.
Finally, looking around your Parliament office, it's full of Beatles memorabilia, and I think there's a signpost of the Who up there. We were going to ask you to play us out Andrew Marr style, but we couldn't bring a guitar. You have recently started playing again, have you?
I have, yeah. Getting calloused on my fingertips.
How I was going to link that in though with elements of the past here. Is there anything that you would change about your past if you could change one thing?
Yeah, I would have persevered with music. I'd have been a rock star by now. You'd have been in the company of someone who probably would have been on a par with the Beatles and the Stones and all that. No, I'd have carried on in music, and I'd have carried on in some way in music. If I wasn't getting anywhere successfully, I'm not talking about national pop star, I'd have gone and played with a pub band. I mean, I did it actually the other weekend in Carlisle at my partner's 50th birthday, and she wanted us to get together for a little band, and it was such fun. And I just wish I'd carried on doing that.
It's not a regret, is it?
It is a regret, I'm afraid. Yeah. So regrets, I have a few.
But then again, Alan Johnson, it's really kind of you to give up your time to talk to us. Thank you very much indeed. Cheers.
Thank you.
Really
Thanks,
appreciate
Oscar.
it. Thank
Cheers.
You.